Friends, today we are at a very unusual spot in a quarry. Now, you might be asking, what does a quarry do with Warhammer, right? But the thing is, when I was looking up inspiration for yellow and black beaten up tanks on the internet, the best thing I found were bulldozers, and most of them were photographed in quarries. So there's that. But you know what? Let's move from this place of huge inspiration and get to the studio. I chose a Sicaran Battle Tank because as a historical armor modeler, its design seemed the most reasonable and plausible to me. I was pleasantly surprised by the quality of the kit. There's no flash, no ejector pin marks, and everything is nice and crisp. But I won't bore you with that. Let's instead get building and modifying. I'm pretty much gonna follow the instructions and build the model in sub-assemblies, starting with the sponsons and tracks. Here I prepared the road wheels by removing the positioning blocks. They allow you to precisely glue the tracks in place, but I'm gonna keep them removable and this will make it easier. After gluing all the major parts in place, I proceeded to remove almost all of the surface detail. There are quite a few rivets on the surface, but most of them are added just for the visual effect and extra detail. Basically, just so we can have something to paint. But their placement makes very little sense. I also tried to break the thick side armor into smaller plates, because I wanted to make it look like the real tank was actually assembled from individual pieces. To be honest, I gave up on that effort after this, but at least I scribed some of the corners to make the individual parts visually separated. Moving on to another detail that's here just for the sake of being there without any logic behind it, these panels had to go. I kept a couple of them in place, but you will see what I did them in a moment. Everything else was flooded with superglue and CA filler and brutally sanded down. Finally, the last destructive touch was gently scraping some of the sharp edges, which not only removes the fuss from sanding, but also gives the whole thing a slightly bulkier, less refined look. Now I could perform one of my favorite building techniques, adding some rough steel texture with Tamiya modeling putty diluted with extra thin cement. Texturing is very easy and it improves the look of the model significantly. Even your painting experience will be slightly different. But the goal isn't to texture every surface of the model, just those super thick plates that would be rolled from heavy steel slabs. A very important step is to gently polish the surface, otherwise it would have an unpleasant, grainy quality. Another cool detail is the flame cut marks. These occur on the cross-section of each plate as a result of the manufacturing process. Sure, it's an effect most often seen on World War II vehicles when the cutting methods weren't as precise and there just wasn't much time to machine those surfaces, but it looks totally awesome and makes the model look even heavier. Now I could make my own bolts from 0.2mm plastic sheets and a punch and die set from RP tools. I tried to place them more logically and yes, even though the kit had rivets, bolts made more sense to me. I tried putting them in places where they would hold armor plates together and where details such as parts of the running gear would be bolted in place and so on. By the way, it's funny how this tank has literally no suspension. Keeping up with the same spirit, I switched my attention to the tracks. These are actually very nice, they just need this ugly seam line to be eliminated. It can take a while, but it's totally worth the effort. Now I try assemble the track according to the instructions. This is vital because there's a specific number of individual links and segments around each wheel, and then glued them all together laying flat on my workbench. After about, let's say, 5 minutes, the track holds together but is flexible enough to be wrapped around the running gear. This way, I'll get a perfectly fitting track that can be removed at any point for easier painting. And now for the final ace in my sleeve, adding weld beads from Tamiya epoxy putty. These have to be rolled into delicate noodles, which is quite easy if you have something smooth like 2 plastic sheets, and some tap water. Then we can start placing them on the model. Now, the main difference between bolts and welds is that what's welded in place stays in that place forever, and what's bolted can be removed. That's why I try to focus the bolts on those parts that might get removed during maintenance or assembly, and welds in places that might have been assembled from multiple pieces, but permanently. As usual, I employed my custom-made tools for texturing. A piece of soda can bent into a C shape for a single bevel weld beads, and a flattened piece of sprue for multiple pass welds. But 95% of the welds on this tank are the cleaner looking single bevel welds, because they just look prettier to me. Okay, that should be about it for the sponsons, and it's also a general overview of what I did on this model. But note that the gun stations are still untouched. That's because the hull is assembled from multiple pieces and some of them are connected, so it's easier to texture them as a single unit. Others, like the driver's compartment, are easier to treat separately. Here's another way to make welds in places where scribing a groove is not so easy. Just some shallow incisions with a blade right on the edge, and then a lick of Mr. Cement S to soften that texture. I love how this kit falls together. It strongly reminds me of Tamiya models. Everything fits perfectly and there are no gaps that would have to be filled. Just some sanding on the glued joints and you're pretty much golden. So now I could repeat the same steps on the rest of the hull. Adding texture on the thick steel plates with diluted putty, making new bolts for the add-on armor and other pieces, and more weld beads. Here I kinda gave up on the authenticity of the vehicle because first, it's impossible, and second, why not embrace it? So I just tried to make it look cool and give it some interesting textures. And also do some extreme things that otherwise wouldn't be possible on historical or modern vehicles. I also wanted to keep this build completely out of the box, but the exhausts are the best candidates for aftermarket replacements. I briefly considered 3D printing my own with better details, but then again, I wanted to keep it out of the box. The turret offered even more fun in the texturing department. Judging by its shape, it would clearly be a metal casting, and that means we can play around with cast metal textures, which are much more brutal than rolled steel. They can vary depending on the manufacturing process, but because there are no real-life references for this tank, I employed a couple of fun techniques and ended up with a pretty rough surface that's pretty similar to turrets on Soviet tanks from World War II. Coupled with some additional weld detail and flame cut marks, it's a small model on its own. I also added the sponson-mounted secondary guns, and here I simply chose what I found attractive. I have no knowledge about the universe, so if I broke some rules here, I did it unknowingly. So anyway, that concludes the construction and the tank is pretty hefty. I hope that the texturing technique made it even more like heavy metal, and with that wish, let's head to the painting workbench. After breaking it up into sub-assemblies, washing them all in soapy water, spraying with a lot of isopropyl alcohol, and attaching everything to an improvised handle, I can start painting. I went with a dark brown primer because I'm going to employ an approach that's almost the same as my previous model, the Rusty Locomotive. And for that, I need a solid, rusty undercoat, and Mr. Mahogany Primer is just the best for that. The primer alone wouldn't be sufficient enough though, so I went ahead and gave the surface more variation using these new AK Real Color lacquer paints. I like how they have a dropper bottle so you can precisely nail the paint and thinner ratio. Combined with Mr. Leveling Thinner, they spray like a dream. I also added a few spots of less corroded metal with a grey Tamiya paint, diluted with the same thinner. Now that's a pretty decent rusty base coat for some heavy hairspray chipping. And that's gonna be a pretty intense job because the model isn't the smallest, and I'm going to add a lot of chips. As such, a good layer of VMS chipping medium is required. With the top layer, I decided to play it safe and use Tamiya acrylics because I'm already familiar with their chipping characteristics. I started with a nice, thin coat of pure white, which will provide more opacity for the actual color of the tank. It's just a small trick. A white base coat needs fewer layers to cover it up than a dark rusty coat. As for the actual color of the tank, I went with the Imperial Fist Yellow because it's very unusual to what I usually paint. But just my luck, I ran out of flat yellow on my previous model and forgot to buy a new bottle. It was my intention to use a very desaturated yellow anyway, so I guess it wasn't such a big deal. Now, the chipping involves moistening the surface with tap water, which activates the fluid, and then carefully scraping it with an old airbrush needle and some stiff brushes. This whole concept comes from my initial thoughts about this project. Someone told me that the Imperial Fist color scheme isn't the easiest to paint and they're curious to see my approach. And I thought, hey, just look for real-life references, you know? And the first thing that popped to my mind was Caterpillar bulldozers. They are yellow and black, and the internet is full of photos of old, dirty and rusty bulldozers. So my whole concept was to pretty much paint this tank like a dozer. That includes extensive chipping on the lower parts where it would smash into rocks and other obstacles, as well as the overall weathering. I even planned a scenic base for it, but later decided to present this as a standalone model. Next up, I had to seal the areas where another layer of paint will go, and VMS flat varnish is the best thing for that. Then I gave it another layer of chipping fluid and sprayed the dark areas with flat black, lightened up with a dusty color for a slightly warmer hue. In some cases, we don't even have to use masking tape because the chipping fluid will act as a mask. The overspray is very easy to remove for a nice, sharp-looking finish. On the front, I had to make a distinction between areas that are right in the open to be smashed into objects and those that are protected by the bulky armor. The amount of chipping will obviously have to vary here, but don't worry, we'll make it more interesting with other techniques. With that out of the way, I could quickly apply the markings. Each area received a coat of Tamiya gloss varnish for good measure, and I was a bit worried about the decal quality. But very quickly I noticed that this will be one of those cases where the decals are absolutely fantastic. And yeah, after just a little amount of decal setting solution, the carrier film completely disappears and the print sits nicely into the rough steel texture. Absolutely terrific. All I had to do then was to spray these sections with flat varnish again to properly integrate them into the surface. But this next step is closely tied to the decals because I started the post-shading process by spraying a very thin coat of white ink on top of them. Moving on to the whole model, I used yellow ink to add more vibrancy to the finish. I focused it around corners but was pretty generous with the application. Basically, I tried to sort of fix that faded greenish yellow and give it more punch. What's awesome about inks is their vibrancy but at the same time translucency. I can easily spray it over those chipped areas without toning the worn effect down too much. And because they're diluted with tap water, I can keep building up the effect without reactivating the dry layers, which is something that can happen with lacquer thinners. This is probably my favorite step in the post-shading process because it breathes so much life into the model. The application is super fun, but the biggest strength of this particular effect is the flexibility. You can make it into several things: an outline of every detail, fake shadow, accumulations of dirt, stains and streaks of oil. It's up to you. It makes the model look like a finished piece, albeit a little soft around the details, but still, it's such a great effect. And lastly, following the same approach as on my last model, I grabbed my mixture of very diluted whole red and flat yellow and sprayed some of the largest chips with it. This is a quick and efficient way of building up the heavy rust accumulations, and we can also introduce even more contrast between different parts of the model. That's why I think it's reasonable to perform this task in the initial airbrushing stages, as we'll still have all the other techniques to refine it if necessary. So that's the airbrushed base coat with all the signs of heavy wear, extensive use, and old age. This is something that would be quite over the top in historical modeling, but it seems that in Warhammer, it might still be very subtle in some cases, as I heard that some tanks can be even over 100 years old. And now for the easiest, most satisfying, most transformative, and undoubtedly the best in terms of effort to result ratio technique, enamel pin wash. For this model, I chose two different shades. A wash for German dark yellow, which is lighter and ideal for most of the surface details, and dark umber for all those deep panel lines, gaps between different parts, running gear components, and the black parts of the paint job. It's one of the techniques that looks awfully messy at first, but once we blend the paint, it completely changes the result. The effect can look too strong and weird on a model painted in a plain color, but it works extremely well with a post-shaded surface. It's basically a small system that I started using over the past years. Some post-shading, a model with a matte texture, and pin washes. These three factors together can lead to pretty exciting results, because in addition to what I already said, washes blend differently on glossy, satin, and matte finishes. A surface that has no shine absorbs some of the paint, and once you start blending, it creates these subtle stains around details. We can drag them outward to add even more dirt in specific places as well, and that's what makes this technique so flexible. Just check out how much has the model changed with just a pin wash. I often want to call the model finished after this step, but there's still a lot of work ahead of us. So let's put the metal palette and enamels aside and crack open the wet palette. I mean, this will just involve painting all the small details, so I'm not gonna spend that much time here because I'm sure everyone has their own favorite color palette for specific things. For example, painting fake glass is something Warhammer painters have perfected, and I'm just trying to learn what they already know. But it's always satisfying to observe the process. When it comes to weld beads, there are two things we can do with them that I know of. First is a pin wash, which we already did, and second is to add some chipping on top of them as well. Welds have a very shiny quality to them thanks to the alloys used in the process, and they take much longer to rust compared to steel plates. As such, using shiny silver paint to add some chips on top of them is a great way to add authenticity, but also make these details stand out. I also used a darker steel color for the road wheels, although the effect is gonna be completely invisible. Painting these shell casings in a shiny brass finish is not just satisfying, but it creates another shiny detail that's gonna stand out nicely on the beaten up rusty tank. Okay, so let's now put the acrylics aside and instead prepare a dry palette for oil paints. It's good to let the excess oil from them seep into a piece of cardboard, as then they'll dry to a matte finish and also they'll dry faster. I'm only gonna use a couple of rusty tones to enhance the worn finish of the tank. These are absolutely fantastic for the exhausts where they work together with the acrylic grayish white-brown base coat that I applied previously. Once they dry, some of the acrylics will be visible, resulting in a nice heat-affected rusty metal. But their greatest strength is the ease of control and subsequent blending, making them ideal for more subtle hints of rust around the smaller chips. This is where the airbrush might become too difficult to handle, resulting in an overpowering effect that would make the tank look like a rusty Hulk. It's also worth mentioning that rust zones work really well with yellow, but also they can become quite overpowering. I'd be definitely more careful on an operational historical tank, but on a civilian bulldozer or a made-up war machine, I think it's completely up to each of our individual tastes. I also tried painting the secondary guns in a more Warhammer style according to the box art, because I thought they contrast nicely with the weathered tank, but they also needed a bit of weathering so they wouldn't look completely out of place. At this stage, we can start putting some of the assemblies together. For example, the turret won't receive much weathering after this point, and having the main guns in place gives us a better idea of the overall look of the model. Looks pretty heavy metal to me, so I think we can move on to the earth effects. When I'm creating mud or thick accumulations of dirt, I like to start with volumes and textures. Textured acrylic mud from AK is the ideal medium for the job because it's very sticky, doesn't shrink when it dries, and actually has a very nice realistic texture. It's also fairly easy to control because of its consistency, and if needed, it can be blended with tap water, but here we have to work quickly because it starts drying almost immediately. The tracks would carry a lot of loose soil and rocks onto these exposed areas, so I enhanced them with some real earth from my garden, trademark. Sometimes you just can't beat natural products, especially when you're aiming for this loose texture. The best way to hold it all in place is by using VMS ballast freeze, which is acrylic, doesn't attack the paint, and dries rock hard. You just have to remove the excess because it would leave visible blobs on the surface. If you'd like to try some of these VMS products as well, you can get them directly from VMS if you're in Europe, or Michigan Toy Soldier if you're in the US. And if you use my sale coupons, you'll get a nice discount. Links are down below. Next up is pre-dusting with an airbrush. This way we can shift the tone of the earth and also prepare a sturdy, opaque base coat for the enamel effects. It can also visually soften the transition between the muddy and clean areas. It's important to choose the right dust tone, and in this case, I went for a grayish one, which would contrast nicely with the yellow tank. The rest is all about enamel paints, and it always feels discouraging at first because everything just looks so messy and weird. My basic approach is to start with the lightest tone of dust and dry mud, and then add darker tones later for variation. It's also advisable to leave the first layer dry overnight so you don't reactivate it with enamel thinner as you're blending the subsequent layers. Of course, there are different ways and mediums to achieve this look, but I find enamels to be the most convenient for my needs. Darker tones can be used to add more variation to the dust, or create areas of damp mud. It all depends on the intensity and application. This is my favorite step in the process because the final result is starting to become more evident. All these enamel effects are from AK. Same goes for the oil paints I used for the rust, as well as the acrylics I used for detail painting, or the lacquer paints used for the rusty base coat. You can get them all at a better price if you follow my affiliate link in the video description, as well as a discount if you use the coupon, which you'll find there as well. Each purchase helps me out. There are also dedicated products for wet mud or stains of oil, but I like to keep things simple and use a dark wash, the same one I used previously. These effects are the cherry on top, and it's very satisfying to apply them on a completely weathered tank. It's that stage where it should be clear if the model is gonna look good, or you'll need to go back a few steps and do some touch-ups here and there. The tracks were painted in the same manner. The techniques are the same, but the application is much easier because they're gonna be quite messy just everywhere, compared to the tank where we had to be more careful. The most important thing here is to make the weathering on the tracks look identical to those areas of the model that are directly affected by them. So if the tracks are covered in dark, wet mud, the piles of earth at the front of the tank should have the same color. Finally, all that's left to do are some finishing touches. One of them involves a pencil and is one of the most powerful methods because it gives the heavily worn areas a realistic heavy metal shine. If you make a mistake, it's easy to fix with enamel thinner, which dissolves the graphite. It's also worth mentioning how the effect can tone down the overly rusty look of the model, because suddenly most of the large chips have a dark, shiny finish instead of being just rusty. On the other hand, it's advisable not to touch the model with your bare hands after this step, so it might not be completely ideal for, let's say, gamers. I also added a bit of smoke residue on the weapons. This one is supposed to be some kind of laser, but I don't know, it kinda reminds me of a flamethrower, so I was more generous with the application. The easiest way is to use a black pigment, but again, no touching because it's very easy to leave your fingerprints on this type of surface. I also polished the cleats on the tracks, but these were easier to pick out with silver acrylic paint. With that out of the way, I just slammed the turret in place and my mission was done. So that about does it, my friends. At first, I wanted to try painting this model in one of those hyper-realistic styles, but as I was progressing, I found that to be not so appealing. The fantastical shapes of the vehicle just don't lend themselves to that approach, so it felt more natural for me to employ a bit of post-shading and other stylistic choices. But still, if you focus the most effort on chipping, rust zones, dust and mud, and of course the heavy steel textures and welds during the construction stages, I think the result can look quite realistic and gritty. This was my first venture into Warhammer and it was quite enjoyable. Especially when you're not limited by the historical conditions and you can push the weathering and aging as far as you want. If you're an armor modeler, I hope you found this video fun, and maybe you'll get a taste for some Warhammer as well. And if you're a Warhammer painter, I hope you found this slightly different approach interesting to look at. From what I've seen and heard, enamels or oil paints are not as common here, and most of the effects are achieved with acrylics. So if you found some new products or approaches to weathering that might help you, I'll be so happy to hear about that. The next model is gonna be a total passion project for me, so I hope you'll join me again. But until then, I want to sincerely thank every single one of you for watching these videos, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be sitting here building models for a living, and I can't thank you enough for this amazing opportunity. All of this is also possible thanks to my incredible patrons. My whole Patreon page is like a Night Shift magazine subscription, as I post there pretty often. And you'll get updates from my workbench where I share my thoughts and insights. We can get in touch through DMs, comments and emails. I'm posting 1 week early ad-free videos and those stay there forever so you can always get back to them. I also have some extra goodies such as 3D models which you can use for detailing your projects, a bunch of real-life references for nature, old buildings and so on, and last but not least, these high-resolution studio photos which show the model in more detail than video ever could. It would help me a lot, but no pressure. Anyway, I found some new materials and approaches for a little something that I enjoy doing every now and then, and I'm extremely excited to try it out. So much that it was distracting me towards the end of this project, so I'm gonna get to it immediately. Until then, you all stay safe, be nice to one another, take care of each other, build your models, don't just collect them, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers! Friends, today we are filming at a pretty unusual spot in a quarry. Now, you might be asking, what does... Now, you might be asking...